Good morning and welcome to the Terry Talks Nutrition Educational Webinar Series. Today's topic, how politics and policies affect our food. And we'll be getting started in about 1 or 2 minutes, 10 a.m. Central Time. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please call 866-569-3239. Thank you so much for your patience. We'll be getting started in just about 1 minute. Good morning and welcome to the Terry Talks Nutrition Educational Webinar Series. Today's topic, how politics and policies affect our food. Let's get started. If you are experiencing any difficulties with hearing the audio portion of today's webinar via your computer, feel free to switch over to listening to the audio on telephone at any point in time. That number is 877-668-4493. If you're satisfied with the quality of the audio from your computer speakers, there's no reason to switch. If you are listening by telephone and at any point in time your call is dropped, just re-enter the access code and you'll be immediately reconnected to this telephone call. This information will appear at the bottom of each of the slides. And again, if you're having trouble and need technical support, please call 866-569-3239. I'd also like to show you the best way to ask questions. So at some point during today's presentation, you may have a question, and if you're like me, you might forget that question when you get to the end of the presentation. So a great way to track those questions is to jot down a little note in the Q&A box. And as you'll notice, in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, there's a Q&A box. If you don't see it, that just means it's not open. So press the Q&A icon up at the top. A little question mark inside of a box and the Q&A will open. Type your question down here in the small box or your comment, press send, and your message will appear up here. And we'll start a list and we'll have all of the questions and comments in the order in which they are received. You'll also notice that there's a chat box. Chat box is two-way communication, and we use that if you're having some type of difficulty on the call. If you need to ask a question via the chat box, for example, of the host, Lexi Locke, perhaps you're having trouble seeing the slides or the slides aren't advancing or you're having a problem of some sort and you want to send a behind-the-scenes chat, it's the same process. Open the chat box, type your message in the lower little square at the bottom, press send, but this time before you press send, you can select out that you just want to send it to the host. If you ask a question via the chat box, please monitor the chat box because that is where your answer will occur. Now, again, if you're asking questions or have comments that you want addressed at the end of today's presentation, please use the Q&A box. If you have some type of problem and need to communicate with the host of today's webinar, please use the chat box. Well, with that housekeeping out of the way, I want to introduce to you Michael Baranowski. Michael is a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. He's the author of Navigating the News, a Political Media User's Guide, and he is co-host of the incredibly popular The Politics Guys. That's a weekly podcast that's dedicated to reasoned, civilized political debate and analysis that has been exploding in popularity, and we're extremely fortunate to have such a knowledgeable individual with us today to talk about the place where politics and food intersect. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
You know, how did you come to be interested in food politics?
Well, it was really a number of things. One of them was my wife's interest. My wife actually teaches political science as well, international politics, and she's had a long-term interest in food politics more internationally. And she wrote a book from jicama to jackfruit, and I helped her, with some of the process of that, and I got interested myself. And I think combined with that, we decided it would be interesting if we could work on something together, and we thought, well, food politics would make a lot of sense. But more than that, more than an academic interest, we have a real personal interest. I have what you would definitely call a non-standard American diet. I'm low carb, low sugar, no red meat. I eat a lot of organic foods. My wife adds in being a vegan to that, and so food is a big part of our lives and trying to eat healthy and be healthy. And so all that sort of combined to get me interested.
Well, let's move on to some interesting ways in which politics make or play a role in our food choices. And also the reverse. Do our food choices have political meaning? And can you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, every time you make a purchase, you in some way support, the people who are selling that, whether it's, a local farmer or agribusiness, some big, factory farmer sort of person. There are serious animal welfare issues involved in that. So, I mean, I don't think as consumers, every time we purchase anything, we are making a political choice because, all of these folks at some way or another are involved in the political process, looking for either certain types of regulation or government action or looking to be relieved from that. And so we can't help but be political in our food choices, even if we don't want to be.
Purchase or decline purchasing. I'm sorry, I think I had an audio problem there for a moment. Can you give us an example of a food that people purchase or refrain from purchasing has a political impact?
Sure.
How would that work?
Yeah, well, I guess one example that is sort of a part of my everyday life is I refrain from purchasing any sort of meat products that don't meet a certain animal welfare standard, essentially. And that sends a message. It supports people who provide better conditions for animals, and it takes my money and sends it to them and not to some big agribusiness factory farm that has practices that I don't feel are things that I'm ethically comfortable with.
So when you make those kinds of choices, do you ever have any follow-up statistics or information? For example, many of the listeners are probably equally interested in animal welfare and also try to purchase cruelty-free products. I know I do myself. But I never really know what that impact is. I never see any measurements out there. Is there any kind of tracking that's being done or shifting, for example, that as people become more aware of the availability of cruelty-free products, do we see a growth in those products? Who's tracking that kind of information?
I mean, we definitely do. There are a number of interest groups who track those things. One group, for instance, for organic products is the Organic Trade Association, and they track, among other things, the growth in sales of organic products. And that's probably the best way to get a sense of this is as those sales grow, we tend to see also on the political front, we tend to see those organizations be better able to lobby both state governments and the federal government to enact the sort of policies or alter certain policies to make it easier for them to bring healthy food, healthy products to Americans.
Do you have any sense of the success? I mean, do we know if there's been, I mean, it appears to me, and I see statistics about overall growth in the natural products industry, but do you see a growth in this area? Is it continuing to grow year by year?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question, especially in, for instance, organics, growth has been explosive. You know, there was a time not all that long ago where organic sections, I'm sure, you know, listeners know, organic sections in regular kind of standard supermarkets were sort of small and sad sort of things, but that's really changed. It's a lot easier to get these products, and because consumers are spending more on that, that makes it easier for producers to band together and try to, you know, make certain get certain changes to laws and regulations to make it easier for them to bring even more of these products to people.
You know, another thing, and I know we're going to talk about this in a moment, which has to do with the intersection of food and politics, and a lot of the non-GMO movement. And also, I know a lot of people are very concerned about Roundup residue in their crops, even if the crops are non-GMO. So, but another question has to do with these labels that we're using to try to make the best choices. Is organic always organic? I mean, are all organic labeling, is it all the same? I mean, I think, can people be misled by overuse of the word organic? That's what I guess I'm asking.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Unquestionably, there's the word organic is thrown around a lot. Now, the phrase USDA organic has a specific meaning, and the only folks who are allowed to use that label on their products have to meet certain standards in terms of, well, obviously no chemicals and pesticides, and you know there's a long list of standards that they have to meet. But so there's that, but there's also this issue of how organic producers are certified. There are some people who feel that the federal government has not done nearly enough in this area, and that sort of there are some perhaps bad actors who can circumvent the system in certain ways, and so then that leaves the public not necessarily knowing exactly what they're getting in some instances.
Well, what has surprised you the most about how politics intersect with food production?
Well, you know, I guess in a way, not a lot. And what I mean by that is that this is yet another issue where, you know, where corporate big money interests almost always carry the day when they have a preference. I mean, as a political scientist who studies American government and policy, I've seen this in area after area. And food, even though it's such an important and vital thing, and, you know, the kind of the basis of good health, you know, that and exercise, right, that it's just another issue to so many of these people, and it becomes primarily an economic issue. And so it's so hard for people to sort of break out of the stranglehold almost in some cases that large, very well-funded corporations and their lobbyists have, whether it's on state government or in Washington, D.C.
Well, that's one of the questions that has come through, is looking at politics, that it always seems like the group with the deepest pockets and the most lobbyists wins. Is there a way politically that we can break big food's stranglehold on food production?
You know, that's a great question, and it's just incredibly difficult because it doesn't matter if the issue's, you know, food or anything else really. There's just a ton of research that suggests money is what carries the day. Now, there are certain instances where that won't necessarily happen, but it requires a real kind of a mass public movement to kind of push back against certain things. But the problem with that, of course, is not just getting the public interested and excited and mad in some cases, but keeping that level of public engagement up. And that is just so difficult to do because, you know, for so many things, when the cameras turn off and the rallies end and so forth, there are still those lobbyists in the hallways in Washington, D.C. who are doing their work, getting paid very well day after day after day, and that's really the struggle.
You know, I've also noticed that, I mean, I've been around this natural products industry for quite a while and have been aware of the differences in dietary changes and what impact that can have on health. And one of the biggest events that we've been faced with are the refined carbohydrates. And when I was growing up, breakfast cereal was pretty much just sugar. It was sugar and some kind of white grain, like either
Yeah.
a refined rice or refined wheat or refined corn. It was delicious. It was
Oh,
just
yeah.
like candy in a bowl, you know. And we were misled into thinking, or our parents were misled into thinking, that a great breakfast was a piece of Wonder Bread with margarine, a bowl of cereal with milk, and a glass of orange juice. So when I think back to the sheer volume of sugar hitting the bloodstream from a breakfast like that, it kind of makes me cringe. I have noticed, though, that the breakfast cereals are starting to make some changes, or have been making the changes over the last decade, to try to incorporate more whole grains, try to reduce the sugar content. It almost feels like, because it's so easy to give your children, I'm not picking on cereal, I'm just using it as an example, but it's so easy to give your children cereal for breakfast. It takes very little preparation, they love it, you don't have to argue about eating it, that they're almost like making token changes so that you can relieve your conscience and feed your children breakfast cereal again. So I see that in with a lot of big food, is that they make these small changes, like, oh, now it's 10% whole grain, or now we've added vitamin C, or, you know, that sort of thing. Have you noticed that as well, that there's changes that help with marketing but may not be making the biggest changes that will help with health?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. In fact, I would argue that sometimes is worse than no change at all. I mean, everyone pretty much knows, right, that just to pick a brand at random, that Frosted Flakes are not necessarily the cornerstone of a healthy diet, right? When I grew up, they used to be called, I think, sugar Frosted Flakes. But the danger, just like you pointed out, is when they make these token changes, and we see this all the time in terms of politics as well, where little changes are made so that people can say, well, yes, we did. We responded to the public outcry for healthier this, that, or the other thing, but the changes are largely cosmetic, and that gets the public to sort of die down in their concern. But it's dangerous in two ways. Number one, that the fundamental problem hasn't been dealt with, and number two, and here's where I think the real danger comes in, is people are misled into believing something is really healthy when it's not, when it's just a marketing gimmick or, you know, a marketing ploy. And so I think that can actually have a really negative effect overall, and that's a real concern, or it should be.
Mm-hmm. It's the other thing is to find the latest, most popular catchwords in the food industry, like gluten, and start to label products gluten-free. Sometimes the products never contain gluten in the first place.
Right.
You know, they did the same thing with cholesterol, labeling plant products cholesterol-free. Yeah. Well, there is no cholesterol in plants. So it just seems like there's an awful lot of word massaging to get people to continue to buy the products and not be quite so worried about whether they're healthy or not.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not, you know, it's not just word massage, you know, that's a big part of it, but it's also when, you know, when regulators attempt to sort of create more clear and rigorous standards, there are, you know, industries that are pushing back against that and trying to essentially, you know, the word organic, and people use natural and all kinds of sort of similar type words, and what that basically does is it certainly confuses the issue, and oftentimes when people try to say, well, let's tighten up this wording so that the public knows what they're getting, there are some pretty deep-pocketed interests who don't really want to see that happen because it would hurt their bottom line.
Well, it's a product that would be made from white sugar and white flour could be organic and non-GMO. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's healthy for you.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. How about this GMO issue, genetically modified organisms? And I know that that's another thing that has been a political debate, like should we label GMO foods? I almost feel like maybe we are trying to shut the barn door after the horse has gotten away, because we've had GMO foods in our food supply for a long time without our awareness of that. What do you think of this movement? And again, is it a label that's being used by people to try to increase sales?
Well, you know, I think this is a fascinating issue. It's an issue that, as a political scientist, we sometimes call it a cross-cutting issue, because it isn't necessarily entirely associated with Democrats or Republicans, and I think it can be especially contentious, I've noticed, among some who would generally consider themselves politically liberal. There are some people, obviously, who are very clearly and strongly concerned about GMOs, believing that they're bad for a lot of reasons. And we'll point to, for instance, Europe, where there are, regulations and labeling and so forth, and say, well, why don't we have that here? Then there are others who essentially would say, well, like you said, well, we've had GMOs forever, and the scientific community suggests that there's no real harm that would come from them. And then, you have the counterclaims of, well, that's, many of these studies are sponsored by groups like Monsanto and so forth. And so it's from a political standpoint, it's really sort of a fascinating issue in that sense. And certainly from a marketing standpoint, you're absolutely right that people use that as a way to, try to sell more product.
This is taking a step aside. When we talk about genetically modified organisms, it's not always just the food itself that's problematic, that you've invented something that didn't exist before. That's not always the issue. The issue is that the reason that they've created a GMO is to make it resistant to, for example, pesticides. And now you can grow more corn or more soy per acre because you can bat down all the weed growth that competes for the nutrients in the soy with Roundup.
Right.
And then now we're starting to, because that sounds like a good idea. I mean, if you're just sitting around the table with a bunch of scientific friends, doesn't that sound like an awesome idea? We got this pesticide. It sounds great. Yep. We're going to increase production. The farmers are going to make more money. The companies are going to make more money. We're going to be able to provide more food or whatever it is we're trying to provide. But then they don't think about, well, wait a minute. We haven't ever used Roundup at that scale before. Isn't it glyphosate? Am I saying that correctly? I think it's glyphosate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well,
now we're dealing with the residue of glyphosate in all of our food.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there were really, it seems to me, there were really two issues that come up, and that's certainly the one you mentioned. It's the first one, the health consequences, and not just from residue, but from what it's doing to potentially to our food supply. But the second one, I would argue, is also a really important issue. Is certainly this is the sort of thing that if you sell these Roundup-resistant GMO seeds, that gives you a very important position in the market. And so then you have these questions of, well, are we creating an uncompetitive market and locking people in to a certain product? And is that good for the economy, for the agricultural economy in the long term? And do we really want to give a certain small number of companies this amount of power because of this structure that's been set up? And, I think that's a really serious concern as well.
Absolutely. One of the, when we listen to, your podcast aside, when we listen to a lot of the media, when we talk about politics, they point to the fact that Americans are incredibly divided by political party, perhaps more so than any time in recent history. And I don't know if you agree with that or don't, but it makes it appear to be difficult to find common ground to try to tackle some of these food issues. Do you see a difference in how each of the political parties approach legislation on food production? And do you have any ideas, or have you heard of any ideas that might be, as I say, common enough that could be embraced by both political parties?
Well, as a general rule, and this is true in food as well as a lot of other things, Republicans tend to be more for loosening regulations and restrictions on all kinds of businesses. That would include, involving food. Whereas Democrats tend to be a little more for stronger, especially federal regulation of things. Now, but having said that, there's definitely also, I guess, what you might call a regional split, meaning that there are plenty of farm state Democrats who are fairly supportive, for instance, of agribusiness and so forth, which kind of makes sense because that's, a major company in their area, that sort of thing. But in terms of common ground, maybe one issue that I could say there seems to be a certain amount of common ground on is food safety issues, at least in general, food safety, because when we hear of outbreaks and so forth, it's sort of hard to be against food safety, but when it gets into sort of how do we go about ensuring that, that's when really agreement tends to fall apart because, again, as a general rule, Democrats want to see greater government, especially federal government capability to do these things, whereas Republicans tend to look more for solutions that focus on the market self-policing, or perhaps taking some of these functions that the government does and farming them out to private organizations.
You know, something that was interesting to me, because I do not embrace the concept of fast food, and I also, it's not easy for me to embrace the concept of huge companies making decisions that affect our lives, but it is the reality. But I did read an interesting article on food safety that when McDonald's grew to prominence, that it dramatically increased the safety of the beef, because McDonald's had certain standards that if you wanted to be a supplier for them for their hamburgers, we can debate later whether those hamburgers are healthy or not, but if you wanted to be a supplier for the largest chain of hamburgers in probably the world, that you had to meet certain standards before they would consider you, and that just by their prominence alone, that they dramatically improved a lot of the safety issues having to do with the handling of beef, the harvesting of beef, and the packaging. Had you heard that as well?
Yeah, I mean, and that's been the case for a number of other, large producers, large companies, and certainly that can move the needle in terms of safety and quality faster than almost anything else, because there's that direct economic incentive. And so that absolutely has been maybe one of the things you can point to for bigness, where that that works out fairly well, you can argue, for the consumer.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us some examples about how politicians and politics have changed the way we eat?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, I go all the way back to 1906, where something called the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed. And most people don't realize this probably, but in the 18th and 19th centuries, I mean, it was pretty much anything goes, Wild West type of thing. You could sell whatever you wanted with no standards, and people were getting sick and dying, and there were a bunch of these exposés about how awful some of these practices were. And that led to legislation that required certain sanitary practices, certain labeling requirements. It, in fact, is what created the Food and Drug Administration eventually. And so that made a huge difference. And if we want something a little more recent, I would say something like, for instance, the Organic Foods Production Act back in 1990, which basically took, I mean, before this, there were a bunch of states that had their own separate organic standards. The problem with that was then what counted as organic in, say, Washington State might not count as organic in Ohio or New York or something like that. And so having a national standard was hugely important. Now, this took a while for this to actually come about, because like with so many things, Congress passes a bill and then you actually have to set things up, and that took the better part of a decade actually for it to happen. But having that standardization of what organic means, I think, was hugely important and really helped in terms of the growth of the industry.
Interesting. Switching gears a little bit, there have been attempts by government to try to force people to eat in a healthier manner. I mean, I remember I actually don't remember the news story as much as I remember the comedians making fun of the news story when New York wanted to pass the size limit of how large of a soda you could serve
right.
in a fast food restaurant. So, is it possible that we can pass legislation that encourages strongly Americans to be healthier eaters?
Yeah, I understand why some of these things are mocked, and certainly it can be done in a way that's too heavy-handed, and many Americans understandably react to being told what to eat. But yes, I think there's research that shows that absolutely that can make a difference. Government action can make a difference. For instance, things just as simple as explaining what a good diet consists of. And one of the things we could talk about is the evolution of the what used to be the food pyramid when I was growing up, and that changed. I think it's my plate now. And there's a lot of politics that goes into that, and I would certainly still think there's some work that remains to be done on that, but that can absolutely have an effect. Or things like, for instance, removing soft drinks from schools, or mandating calorie counts. I know from my own personal experience, for instance, I go to Starbucks on a a semi-regular basis, and all of a sudden when I saw calorie counts up there, it made me think, do I really want a 400 calorie piece of pie? No, I don't actually, and so, that kind of simple thing, just by providing consumers with more and better information, or for instance, labeling requirements, right? I mean, for instance, if there was a time when labeling requirements were very different, but now labels, I think, are better than they've ever been, and it's a lot easier to say, well, how much sugar's in here, how much fat, how many calories, and to millions of Americans, that can make a real difference. So I think the sort of legislation, the sort of government action that can really help is legislation and action that better informs consumers about what they're choosing to eat. But legislation that tries to kind of make people choose something, well, that tends to oftentimes, I think, backfire a little bit.
One of my biggest complaints was, well, first, I didn't grow up being a label reader because, as you said, we weren't always required to label the way that we do now. But I can remember glancing at, counting calories and glancing at the back of a single size serving size of chips or a bottle of soda back before I became enlightened, even a candy bar. And you'd read it and you'd think, oh, that's not so bad, and then you don't think about it. And then at some point in time, you really read the label, and you see that they've decided that that single serving bag of chips is actually 2 or 3 servings.
Yeah.
And what they've reported to you is a third of the bag of chips, or a third of the bottle of soda, or a third of the candy bar. Has there been any legislative changes that on single serving packages they can't be breaking it down into multiple servings like that to try to mislead people to thinking there's less bad stuff in it than there actually is?
Well, for a lot of this, actually, how it works is sort of interesting, because oftentimes it's the threat of legislative action that causes the industry to decide to act on their own before they're being forced to do something by government. So in many cases, government can have a huge effect simply by the implicit threat of cracking down, which is why, for instance, there aren't a whole lot of mandatory food recalls or drug recalls, because manufacturers want to do this on their own, get out in front of it, before they said, well, we've been forced by the government to do this, and all of a sudden they lose control of that. So oftentimes industry will self-regulate because they want to avoid government regulation on these things.
I hadn't thought of that perspective. That that seems like a nice combination of the carrot and the stick.
Mm-hmm.
The people that are listening today are people that are generally highly involved in the natural products industry, natural health, or they're choosing natural products for themselves. So they're very interested in these types of topics. But when you look at the general public, what do you think that their level of care is about food policy? And does food policy ever motivate individuals to decide on a certain party or a certain candidate? Is it a high-level issue, or is this, for most voters, a low-level issue?
For most voters, it's really not a major concern. Wouldn't even be in polling. Wouldn't even be in their top 10, maybe not even their top 20. For most voters, the issue tends to be cost and availability or access. And so people might react negatively to taxes that, make their soft drink or something like that more expensive, that sort of thing. But there aren't a whole lot of voters for whom food is, as political scientists would say, a highly salient issue. But that being said, oftentimes in politics, that doesn't necessarily matter if there is a strong, committed group of very motivated voters who are willing to get involved and make a lot of noise and write letters and call representatives. That can make a huge difference. So even though there's not, maybe tens of millions, a small number of people sometimes can make a difference if they're really willing to act in a very strong manner.
Well, that's encouraging. It's encouraging that at some level it reaches, I think that from a commercial standpoint, we've seen that it's starting to make a difference, that people, even if they're being misled, they're buying products that say organic, buying products that say non-GMO. So perhaps some of that will trickle up into their interest in the political policies that affect food.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope so.
I would hope so as well. You know, excuse me, is it true, and you may or may not know this, but I have read that food is about as inexpensive in America as it has ever been in the history of America. Is that something that you've encountered as well?
Yes, I guess I'd say yes and no, in the sense that yes, that a lot of you can fill yourself up with a lot of calories for less than probably any other time in America, but the problem, I would argue, is the quality of those calories. And, you know, it's those kind of highly refined carb kind of fast food sort of things where, yeah, I mean, we all see the commercials, right, where you can get this insane amount of food for, I don't know, $2.99, $3.99, and we see, though, what it's doing to Americans' health. So I would argue that that's true, but it's perhaps not really a good thing in terms of, you know, the quality of life and health for Americans.
I think that for a lot of families, it must be extremely difficult if they've got, let's say it's a couple of parents and 2 or 3 children, to fill up a grocery cart for $100 versus $175, depending upon what their choices might be. Yeah. That the price levels are leading them to select the types of foods that perhaps aren't in their family's best long-term health interests.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's been tons of research on that shows that that's exactly the problem. And this is a problem, of course, that, you know, as you point out, affects lower income Americans the most. And when we take a look at health outcomes based on, you know, socioeconomic status, that's exactly what we see. You know, the Americans, the people who are sickest and in most need of good nutrition, of better nutrition, are those people who struggle to afford high quality food. It's not just that, of course, it's, you know, it involves a lot of other issues that let's say, you know, we all know that it's important to eat fresh fruits and vegetables. But that's so much harder to do for somebody who has maybe 3 or 4 kids and is working 2 jobs. And where do you find the time to prepare that? It doesn't keep forever. And so these are issues that are definitely disproportionately affect the poorest and most at-risk Americans.
I was visiting a friend, and it was my first trip to France this past summer. And she has 2 children, one in grade school, one in junior high school, or the equivalent. So not really adult children, but younger. And their eating is so much more diverse. No turning their nose up at grilled duck breast. You know, things that in the United States, if you tried to serve this in a school lunch program, the kids would balk. And because to me it seems like such a wonderful idea to try to introduce healthier foods when you have them as children, for example, in school lunch programs. But if children are used to eating, not eating that way, then they balk at seeing a spear of broccoli or a raw apple instead of a brownie.
Well, you know, I think it's in part it's a cultural problem or a cultural issue, I guess you could say. But also, I think it also gets back to sort of larger decisions that we've made about as a society, as say compared to what sort of decisions France has made about things like how much time workers have and how many hours people, and all these sort of things that really make a difference. Because sure, you know, most people who are listening know that to prepare healthy quality food, it's going to take a little more time and effort and thought than just kind of pulling into the drive-thru and grabbing something for, you know, the family on your way home from work. And so I don't really think we can look at food individually isolated from all these other issues, all these other decisions we've made about social policy, because it really does all work together. We really need to look at it in a holistic sort of way.
When we look at making changes, and this is probably going to be difficult to do because we've brought up so many issues in the course of our discussion today, but if you could make just one change or 2 changes in our political food system, what would it be and why would you make that change?
Well, I have the change I guess I would want to make. I know a lot of times this is the sort of question, and when I interview people, I like to ask this question as well. And so it's a great one. But I want to recommend a change, or recommend a change, it actually has a reasonable shot of happening. Because I'm a pragmatist by nature, so I'm not going to recommend anything politically impossible. As I mentioned earlier, I'm very concerned about animal welfare. I tend to think that 50, 100 years from now, future generations are going to look back at how we treated animals to feed ourselves and just be aghast at what we did. And so the change I would recommend has to do with having the current administration apply a regulatory rule that was that was put into place in April of 2016. And the rule is called the Organic Livestock and Poultry Practices Rule. And what this called for was better animal welfare standards for organic labeled meat products, basically. Now, most people, I think, when they buy, whether it's chicken, beef, whatever, and they say this is organic, they think, oh, happy farm and wonderful conditions and all that. That is absolutely not the case. Under current rules, these animals can be debeaked, they can have their tails clipped, they can be jammed into just ridiculously small places, and it's just horrible. I mean, when you look at it, at least I think so. Well, the USDA called for a change to this to tighten these standards so this kind of thing wouldn't happen. Well, the current administration has decided, well, in fact, 3 times to delay the implementation of this rule because they can't just out and out kill it, although there are some in the administration who would like to. And they just keep on delaying it, now saying that the cost to organic producers is too high, even though the main Organic Producers Trade Association, the Organic Trade Association, not only disagrees, but they've actually sued the USDA to get this rule put into place. And currently it's delayed until May of this year. Again, the 3rd time they moved it back. I'd like to see this rule put into place because I think it can make a real difference in terms of animal welfare. So that would be my entirely doable recommendation, thing I'd like to see changed.
Well, I would 100% agree with you. There are individuals who I've talked to people that have a wide variety of views on this, including people that are very spiritual, who, aside from their empathy for the suffering of the animals, believes that suffering in the animal will transfer itself to the person who consumes the animal. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of thought on this, not just beyond compassion for animals, but a lot of individuals who have strongly held beliefs that it is a bad choice for the human who is consuming these products as well.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I used to think that that sounded a little out there, but the more I learn about the mind-body connection and high levels of cortisol and how stress changes our body, I'm starting to think there might be some physiological truth to some of those spiritual assertions.
Yeah. Yeah, it wouldn't exactly stun me. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I really appreciate your taking time to talk to us about this. We already have some questions in the queue. But before we go to questions, I want to encourage all of you to go to thepoliticsguys.com. All one word, thepoliticsguys.com. Sign up for their podcast. You will be in for a treat. I find it intolerable to listen to people that are talking about politics that have such a strong viewpoint that they're constantly spewing vitriol at their opponents. But this is the one place I believe that you're going to find a true meeting of the minds. You can also follow these folks on Facebook, on Politics Guys page. So just search on Facebook for Politics Guys or Politics Guys page. All right, let's get to some of the questions.
Okay. One quick thing. I totally forgot. I'm sorry. I must have given you some bad information. It's actually politicsguys.com. No the.
Oh, just Politics Guys.
Just Politics Guys. So it's even easier to type in.
All right, cool. That'll save us 3 keystrokes.
There you go.
So politicsguys.com, not no the, and your Facebook page is still Politics Guys page?
That's correct, yeah.
All right, good. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions. One's about the Green Party. Do you think the Green Party has ever had or will have a significant impact on food politics?
Certainly not nationally, and probably even at the state level it's difficult. The problem is that American politics is, the system is designed in such a way to effectively give the two main parties a monopoly over political power. Now, for any listeners who are familiar with other systems of government, like in some countries in Europe, that's not the case, where a party like the Green Party can actually get some influence, some legislative influence, even if they only can get maybe 5–10% of the vote. But because of how our electoral system is structured, it's just incredibly difficult for anyone who's not a Democrat or a Republican, who doesn't essentially kind of ascribe to most of their views, to gain any amount of political power in the system. So not, unfortunately, if you're a proponent of the Green Party, probably not.
I want to point out to our folks that are in our listening audience that there are some technical difficulties in questions or comments that you're sending to the host. If you're just sending them privately to the host, they're not being seen. So either please send them to all or send them to myself, Cheryl Myers. So does organic mean that GMO was not used? Are they the same thing?
Yes, one of the organic, USDA organic standards is that GMOs are not used. And so that's the critical thing, is it needs to say, the label has to be USDA organic. Anything other than that, you're kind of taking your chances.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question about poultry. Is it true, this person has read that the antibiotics given to poultry stay in the body longer than other animals, or that they use more antibiotics in poultry than other animals? And are those having an effect on the people who eat them?
That I don't know, though. I do know that antibiotic use in poultry is huge and a significant concern. But and certainly for researchers studying antibiotic resistance, there have been a lot of studies demonstrating that this is almost certainly a key contributor to this. But in terms of how long they stay in, I don't have the scientific background to really comment on that.
Yeah, I had not heard that, but that's an interesting question.
Yeah, absolutely.
You would think pound for pound that beef cattle, of course, would be given much higher levels of antibiotics, but don't know. What do you think about the current administration's views on food, or is there a current administration's view on food politics that you can summarize?
Well, I would say there is, in the sense that it's kind of part of their larger view to deregulate and sort of let businesses do more of their own thing. It's more of a kind of get out of the way and allow businesses to, well, conduct business how they want. And so that to me is definitely how they've approached food politics. Like I said, the example that I just gave about the USDA rule about organic livestock practices, this administration concluded that it would cost organic producers too much, whereas the previous administration came to an opposite conclusion when they did their own cost-benefit analysis.
That's interesting. All right, let me just go through both screens to make sure I haven't missed any questions. We've had a lot of questions coming in. Oh, here's a person who wants to share with you how much they enjoyed this information. It was great info, and they thank you so much for being a guest on this webinar.
Oh, excellent. I was happy to do it.
All right, let's see. Here's a person who asked, go ahead.
I said I did, while we were looking for questions, one thing occurred to me is that there's one resource I wanted to mention to people. I just wanted to make sure I got this in, is that some listeners might be familiar with her, but Marion Nestle is an amazing person on food politics issues. She's someone who I follow very closely. She has a website, foodpolitics.com. I've actually interviewed her on my show, and for people who really want to dig more into the politics of this, I can think of no better person to follow. She posts stuff all the time. I think it's just absolutely, to me, absolutely fascinating, and I would really encourage people to check her out.
Michael, could you spell that, and I'll send it out to folks. What is it? Marion, M-A-R-I-O-N?
Yep, M-A-R-I-O-N, and then Nestle, N-E-S-T-L-E.
N-E-S-T-L-E?
Yep, exactly.
And the name of her website?
Food Politics. It's at foodpolitics.com.
All right, then I will send that out to everyone so that they know how to spell it and maybe can copy it so that they can do their own research on this topic. Thank you. Here's a person who's asking, it says, not to be contrary, but I thought that there was or is a provision in the USDA organic guidelines that permits GMOs in certain emergency situations. Those products would still qualify as organic. What does that mean? Have you heard that?
I'm not aware of that, though. That may be true. So I can't say for certain, but I do know that the basic guideline, at least the one that I'm familiar with, says that to be certified as USDA organic, you cannot use any sort of GMOs. Though so I'm not sure if that's correct or not. I'd have to do a little more research on that.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what an emergency situation would be as well. So, all right, well, that's a good thing for us to ponder and to continue to look into. There is a question having to do with what people call food deserts. Food deserts are locales, usually in big cities, where individuals don't have access to grocery stores that carry a full line of products, and so they're doing the majority of their grocery shopping in convenience stores. Are there any legislative efforts that you're aware of to try to assure better access to quality food for people regardless of where they live?
You know, that's sort of I think it's a great question and certainly a serious issue. And there are some there's been some suggestion that one way to sort of deal with this would be to provide certain tax incentives to grocers, to folks who would put in stores to kind of deal with this problem. And I seem to recall that it has been, this is the kind of thing that happens more on a local level. I seem to recall that there have been some experiments with this, but I can't recall the particulars of that. Though I think that's certainly a great idea and something I'd like to see. I'd like to see more of, assuming that it actually is effective.
Awesome. That's good news. I'm glancing through to make sure I didn't miss anybody. I've got questions coming in 2 different locations. And, another thank you so much for the excellent information. And I would like to add my thanks to that, Michael. This has been so enlightening for me. I really, really appreciate your taking the time out of your busy day to talk with us today about food politics.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Folks, we are going to close for now, but I've already had a few questions of how they can recommend this or how people can listen to this again. This will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, Terry Talks Nutrition on YouTube. That will be probably within the next 24 hours. So if you have some friends that you think would benefit by listening to this information, or if you want to listen again, be our guest. It's all free, very easy access. So that's youtube.com/Terry Talks Nutrition, and there you will find a full representation of the educational webinars that we've produced. If you would like to sign up for a free weekly newsletter from terrytalksnutrition.com, we have a free newsletter on issues of natural health and also inspirational thoughts. You'll also on this website find recordings of past seminars, so you can get the seminars and webinars on either Terry Talks Nutrition website or on YouTube. And on the Terry Talks Nutrition website, you can ask natural products expert Terry Lemerond your specific questions. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Terry Talks Nutrition. I want to thank you again, Michael, for joining us. I hope you'll join us again for more information on how our food production intersects with politics and vice versa.
Oh, absolutely. I had a great time. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy morning to learn more about the natural products industry, natural health, and natural living. Thanks, and until we meet again, good health to you. Bye-bye.
That was fun. Okay, she's long.